Well, good evening. I'm very glad that you're all here and you took time out of your evening to come and talk about, are you ready for the next big storm? And what I'm going to try to do to kind of set up the other presenters is to just step back from the issue a little bit and cast kind of a big picture in terms of what are we talking about when we're thinking about resilience. This is a term you're going to be hearing a lot coming up both from the federal government, state, and local levels. Resilience meaning preparing your community to be able to bounce back from a shock, some kind of impact, some kind of disaster, making sure that you are ready as an individual and as a community, as a town, to be able to absorb that, whatever form it comes in. In this case, we're talking about storms and hazard impacts, and then be able to carry on afterwards and even be stronger. So that's what resilience is really about, and there's a lot of thrust going forward about that term. And I'm going to try to paint just a framework in terms of how communities and governments at large are kind of thinking about this. And to kind of let you know that a framework is already in place to address resilience. It's not like a new thing, but the way we have to approach it has to be a little bit different than we've done in the past, because our vulnerability to hazards like storms is actually changing. So I'm going to try to talk about how you prepare the whole community to address a threat like storm impacts. And then the other presenters are going to each talk about different topics, and hopefully they're all going to be kind of blend together at the end. So we have an adaptation challenge going on in New England and here in Massachusetts, right here on Cape Cod, where we're facing big storms. That's not new to folks. It's part of the reason why we're doing this series. And we have projections coming out in the climate realm that are telling us that our climate here in New England is changing. Whether or not you are in the realm where you are accepting of climate change or not, the bottom line is that outside of that whole dialogue, we're seeing a lot more intense storms, and we're seeing changes in our local climate patterns and our local weather patterns that are different than we've seen before. And the projection is that our climate over many, many years, over the next kind of 50 to 100 years, will be looking more like a southern states climate. And that has a lot of implications. I don't have time to delve into what that might mean in terms of each aspect of the climate, but big picture sense, we're talking about a different climate regime than we've known in the past. And that is going to mean that we have to look at the way we prepare to deal with that differently. So we have an adaptation challenge to address. Our vulnerability is clear to storms. That's maybe one of the reasons you're here. We've been seeing a lot of storms, a lot of big events all over the country. Not just this year, not just last year. We've been seeing a lot of changing patterns, a lot of intense storms. The projection is that we here in New England will get a lot more intense rainfall events, a lot more big showers that are coming down, dumping a lot of water all at once. In terms of hurricanes, whether or not we get more hurricanes, that I think the jury is still out on, but the intensity of these storms is projected to increase. So we're seeing those changes. Our vulnerability is clear. We're seeing big losses from these events, a lot of economic damage, a lot of personal loss, a lot of community loss. And so this is the backdrop on which we're talking about we as community members, all of us here, not just you, ready for the next big one. Here in New England, we haven't gotten a huge hurricane for a long time. So in terms of the memory of a lot of people, that is absent. But we have a lot of big storms. We have a lot of nor'easters. We have a lot of big winter storms that we deal with in different ways. So that threat is imminent. But I want to step back. Even though our vulnerability is clear, and we have this future projection of what we're likely to see, some of the events that we're seeing are so impressive in terms of the scale of their damage that it just warrants us taking a look at how we're going to deal with these events. And I found this video, had a presenter actually at one of the workshops I organized show this work video, and I thought it was so impressive that I wanted to show it to you. Let me see if I can get it a lot bigger. This happened up in the New Hampshire area. So take a minute or two, but just soak it in. Like the rains. Next worse.
This is in real time, not
Yes,
time lapse?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, jeez. Oh, that's the culvert.
So while our vulnerability is very clear, things like that are happening. We see even the recent floods in South Carolina, all of that, all over the place. Big Sandy event in New Jersey, New York impacts. Sometimes the road to this resiliency that we're trying to achieve is sometimes not very clear. And it becomes overwhelming, just like that video that you saw, in terms of how do we ensure that all facets of our community are prepared and we as individuals are as prepared as we can be. Because it's a kind of thing when you're preparing for something that hasn't happened yet and that you're hoping will not happen. It's not something that you know is going to happen on November 3rd. It's very hard to always keep it at the forefront of your mind. And so this is what I want to park on the next slide in terms of how do we think about improving our resiliency. And a couple key things is that we have to remember that it's about managing risk, right? What is risk? Risk is really the hazard that you're facing times how vulnerable you are to that risk. In this case, we're talking about storms. So storms would be the hazard. And our vulnerability is, you know, where we live, what kind of home we live in, are we homeless, are we not, where we are, those kinds of things, how much money we have to be able to buy resources, that kind of thing. When it clashes with a hazard, it determines how much risk we have. Sometimes when we see like a hurricane or a storm coming and it says it's going offshore, everybody breathes a sigh of relief. It's the same system, but it's not going to interact with vulnerable areas where people are. And therefore, it's not so much a threat anymore to people. So it doesn't become an event that causes a lot of risk in the sense for people. But when we have a storm that is interacting with people where they're vulnerable, then we're talking about increasing risk. And what we can control as individuals is our level of, and as community members, is our level of vulnerability. We cannot control the hazard so much because we can't control how strong of a storm Cape Cod will see, when it will see it. But we can control our vulnerability. That's the part that we can work on reducing how vulnerable we are to the impact. And if we do that, we'll be lowering the risk that we have. And I think this is a big picture kind of viewpoint that we need to maintain. It's about reducing our vulnerability to the hazard. It's also about figuring out the parts that are within our control. And then this bullet, the last bullet up here is about whether it's a natural hazard or a natural disaster. We hear those terms even being used interchangeably. And for me, I worked in the Caribbean for a very long time, working with governments and islands that are very vulnerable to a lot of these events. And one of the things is that, it becomes the thinking whether or not you have a natural disaster, something that is outside of your control. But I would want you to consider whether or not a natural disaster is really something that happens. Is it a natural hazard? Is the disaster natural, or is it the hazard that's natural? The disaster happens because of how we prepare or don't prepare to deal with the hazard. So sometimes we use that term, a natural disaster, and it kind of evokes the sense that we can't control the disaster. But in some sense, we can, because we have control over our vulnerability, how much of it, depending on where we live, how we build. So that's just a thought I'd like to leave with you. And then I want to park on this slide because I think that sometimes, again, I'm just setting up the framework for the other speakers when they're coming, right? Is that how do we respond to these big storm events? The big thought that I want to convey is that this is an integrated framework that a community must use to address these hazards. And by integrated, I mean there is a cycle of emergency management that's already known and has been used over time. This is not a new thing. If you go to FEMA or MEMA or any site, you will see this cycle. You can pull up 100 images of it on the web. But I think that this framework, what I find that is comforting is that a framework is already in place that addresses a lot of the aspects of what we need to deal with as a community to address resiliency. And the reason why I'm bringing it up tonight is because embedded in this framework for resiliency planning is the thought that it must be grounded in community involvement. Otherwise, this cycle cannot be as effective as it would be. And this is where everybody in this room comes in. I want to take a moment and go through the cycle because I run into people a lot who are not aware of this cycle or the pieces of it or how it's connected. And I think it's important as one of the kind of take-home messages from today to understand that this framework for how we think about improving our community resilience and our individual resilience is something worth bearing in mind. You have these four aspects of the cycle. Let's start over here where we have, it's not going to show up on the pointer, it's not going to show up on the screen. Mitigation. Mitigation just really means any action that you're taking, it could be before an event or after an event, to lessen the impact or severity of what you are going to feel. And an example of a mitigation action is like buying flood insurance. That's something that you're going to do to have lesser impact in terms of on your own resources. That's an example of mitigation. Another example of mitigation is where we place infrastructure, how we build buildings, whether they are resistant to storms or not. Those kinds of things fall in the mitigation realm. And Hallie is going to talk a lot about how local governments are working on developing plans to do mitigation better. Then over here we have preparedness. Preparedness is something you do, again, before a disaster event, where you're trying to put plans, processes in place to help you effectively respond. So when you develop an evacuation plan, that would be something that would be preparedness. When you develop, when you figure out where you're going to place food stocks or water stocks, that would be preparedness. When you conduct drills and scenario testing exercises, that's something that would fall into preparedness. Response is after the event happens. After a big storm impacts the area, how does a community or individuals respond? Where do you go? Communities are activating emergency plans, they're getting people, they're coming in and doing search and rescue. All of that falls under response. And then recovery, after an event, how you bounce back, what you do to recover and return to normal. This might seem like a very kind of boring slide, but if you try to kind of think about that in the community sense, part of tonight's talk is to think about what your local government is doing. Local governments, state governments, and the federal government are all kind of working on each part of this cycle. But what is sometimes confusing is that people don't understand that they're all connected. If you don't mitigate well, your preparedness will not be as effective and you'll have a lot more work. If you don't prepare well, your response will be less effective and people will get hurt and property will be damaged. So the more you can connect these different phases, the more it works in a very coordinated fashion. And the community members come in because they have to undergird every part of this plan. And I think it's important to understand that that framework is in operation all the time. It's there to be used, but each part of the cycle needs to be strong for the whole resilience kind of framework to move forward. Couple tenets, it needs to be comprehensive. The community is trying to talk about resiliency planning. It needs to be coordinated, collaborative, and very community-centered, like I said before. I want to stress that. FEMA, in particular, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, really stresses that all of this kind of activity needs to be very grounded and involve the whole community, And you'll see why as I go through this. Joan asked me to kind of set up how different speakers would come tonight, and that's one of the main points I just wanted to leave with you. Our level of ability is changing because the intensity of hazards like storms that we're seeing is changing. We have the capability, though, to respond by thinking about how we can reduce our vulnerability as individuals. But we don't do it in isolation. We do it in a framework of response that's happening at the community level. And that requires that we understand why sometimes the community is making certain decisions to move infrastructure or to place infrastructure in certain places. They're making decisions about what to do with evacuation plans. They're trying to involve the community in all those different steps. And it's important that we all recognize that we each have a role in that in terms of how our communities can respond. Joan, how much time do I have left?
Like 3 minutes, is that?
3 minutes, yeah, good. And she also asked me to just give you an example of a few of the things that we at the Reserve are doing at the community level to kind of address resilience. We're doing a lot more than I would have time to cover in a few minutes, but I'm just going to try to give you a few things to give you a flavor of some of the things that we're doing. One is that we are doing a lot of education like tonight, and we have a couple projects that are in the works to try and get communities to be talking about resiliency planning and talking about how to engage with community members like yourself. And so we have this project called Collaborating for Cape Cod's Coastal Resilience. We also have this project that we recently ended, but we're still using a lot of the products from it, the New England Climate Adaptation Project. And we also have a very cool research project that might seem like it's not connected with resilience or community readiness, but it's dealing with a subject called blue carbon, understanding the value of our coastal wetlands in storing carbon and reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and also the value of coastal wetlands in terms of being a protective natural landform that helps to shelter coastal communities. So that's something that we're working on. And I just want to take a minute and talk about an activity that we're doing in Falmouth, which is with the Community Resilience Index, or the CRI. What we're doing is we're going into communities. We've worked on this tool. Essentially, it's a document that's broken out into different sections where we're covering all these things that the community might be working on: critical infrastructure, transportation, community plans and agreements, mitigation measures. I talked about what mitigation was, business plans, and social assistance. And what it does is we bring all the key players that are working in local government together at a table. Because what often happens is that people are doing their own job, but they're not really talking to each other about resilience. And so you're thinking, oh, we're kind of all working on the same thing, but we don't know what we're doing. So it becomes necessary to have these facilitated dialogues where people are getting together. And out of that exercise, we're identifying how is the town doing in terms of their level of preparedness. And so we did this pilot exercise in Falmouth using this tool, where we had a lot of dialogue about it. It's a self-assessment. They kind of grade themselves on how they're doing. The grade is just for themselves. And then out of that conversation exposes a lot of where it's ready or where they feel they're not ready. What kind of plans are in place, what kind of measures are not in place, and how they can work on that. And then since we've had that, we've been doing a lot of follow-up with them on very individual things that they would like to see done to improve the community's resilience. In Falmouth, one of the things they wanted to work on, they wanted to make sure that they had different systems in place for if a big storm were to impact Falmouth, they would be immediately ready to respond by having whatever, any organization or any company that they needed to come in to do that job. They want to make sure they had those plans or those agreements set up in advance. We coordinated some transfer of lessons with them from towns in New Jersey that were affected by Sandy, so they could be learning from communities that were affected, so they could understand what those communities learned from a big event like Sandy and what Falmouth could do, learning from those areas. And so they have been taking those lessons, so to speak, and implementing and putting in measures in place for how they can do a better job. One of the things that came out of that conversation was the fact that the business community, Falmouth's readiness to respond, would be linked to what the town is doing, what community members are doing, but also how ready the business community is to respond. Because if you can't have businesses coming in to give you resources, or you can't go to a store to buy lumber, or to buy fuel, or to buy water, you're not going to be very able to respond very well when a big storm comes. So all these different pieces seem very disconnected, but they're all really a piece of the pie. And so that's just a flavor of what we're doing in Falmouth. This is something we're trying to repeat with all the towns on Cape Cod. Have these dialogue, use this tool to engage in, and almost like a critical look at where the town is at, and then have them go on afterwards to kind of try and address those gaps. And in Falmouth, we've now started a project with the Chamber of Commerce to really try to work with the business communities, because that's one of the things that came out that was a weak area. Another thing is we're using another tool that we also learned from our reserve in New Jersey called Getting to Resilience. It's another tool about dialogue, about planning instruments, having those things in place. And we kind of did a pilot in the town of Brewster, working on this, something similar to the town of Falmouth exercise. I'm not going to take time to go through it, but the overall goal is to get all the key players at the table kind of talking about these issues, what plans the town has, what is missing, what they need to do next, and hopefully that will inspire some kind of dialogue. In Barnstable, we did another project called the New England Climate Adaptation Project. This was a New England-wide project that involved 4 communities. Barnstable was the town in Massachusetts that we worked with. And out of that exercise, some of you in this room participated in it, we tested whether or not you could use a process called role-play simulations to get community members to talk about storm impacts, what might happen under a changing climate, and how the town could respond. And this is an exercise that we did in collaboration with MIT Science Impact Collaborative and our partners in the reserve system in New England and with the town of Barnstable. This is just a shot from one of the workshops we did here. And what we learned was that people really thought that this could be an effective way to engage community members. It got people to come into the room, play a different role, immerse themselves in dialogue about what the town could do, and discussing different options that the town could take to address storm risk, and what they thought of that. And that was tested in a very scientific manner, and it was found to be something that people felt could be very, very effective. And what it fostered, and the other thing that was learned from this is that the town did also anonymous polling in Barnstable, not just a role-play simulation, to kind of figure out what community members thought about their town addressing storm impacts and starting to deal with climate change. And they found out that all the 4 New England communities, Barnstable was the most ready to deal with it. They really wanted their community to act, but they felt like their community would not act. Very interesting results. And they also, as a result of that project, Barnstable has been inspired to kind of work on adaptation plan, to really think about that. They were doing a lot of things before. This is not like the first foray into thinking about getting their town ready to address these risks. But they became a lot more inspired to work on it. They have started to kind of, and Shannon, the next speaker, will talk about the community rating system, another program that different communities on the Cape are trying to get involved with. She will explain what that program is and why it's important. And they're actively trying to seek funding to figure out how to implement some of the things they want to do to be more prepared. So these dialogues that we're having and these exercises that we're having are encouraging towns to kind of take more steps. They are already doing a lot of things, so I don't want to paint the picture that towns are not addressing any kind of, but they recognize that more work is needed in this area. And the thought I want to convey to you is that the towns are ready to step up and start to plan, and they're going to need a lot of community involvement. One of the things we learned out of the role-play simulations is that people really want to engage in what the community is doing. They wanted the community to ask them to be engaged. They wanted the community to ask them to be a part of the problem-solving process. And so I think you might be seeing a lot more towns trying to make a very concerted effort to really engage community members in participating in this process. And that will bring me, I don't think I have time to go through any of the other projects we're doing, but Joan also asked each of us as speakers to just end on a couple key things that you can take away from each presentation about what you can do, so it can be very practically grounded. So a couple things I thought of is just to remember, as I try to paint the picture about the cycle of emergency management, and that involves the whole community, all these phases connect with each other. And community members often are the first responders. We think about first responders like fire, police, that kind of thing being on the ground, but in the case of a big event, oftentimes your neighbor becomes your first responder, or your family member, or something like that. So because of that, how quickly a community can respond, or how strong you are to deal with such an impact, really depends on how each community member is prepared themselves. A very practical way that you can get involved is to work through faith-based and social systems organizations that maybe many of you are involved in already, nonprofit organizations, key clubs, Rotary clubs, that kind of thing, churches. And really think, if you're part of these organizations, think about whether or not you can talk with your fellow members about thinking about what are we doing in terms of getting our community ready or preparing ourselves to be able to be a part of the solution if we were to be impacted by a big storm. These organizations are already doing tremendous amount of service work, and just putting this layer of thinking about storm resilience on top of what you're already doing could be a very practical way to just strengthen that social system network. Also, it seems like very obvious, but I think it's worth saying that when a town tries to engage with its community members to kind of get your opinion or get you involved, oftentimes response can be low because people don't want to come out for certain things. And this is an opportunity to actually get involved and to make your voice heard. But not just that, they can't get it right in terms of resilience planning without getting community members involved. They will never get that cycle completely right until the whole community is involved as much as it can be. So it really depends on each community member stepping up and playing a part. As to you kind of getting your own business ready, and then lastly, don't depend on the government. This whole talk is about what is your government doing, but my takeaway is don't just depend on what the government is doing, prepare yourself and your family, and that will actually be a very practical way to strengthen your whole community readiness. So that's all I have to say in terms of painting a big picture.